Audre Lorde, in her 1978 essay, The Uses of the Erotic is Power, defines the erotic as that internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. Lorde's work articulates a guidepost for separating the inspired from the less than fulfilling. In the grind of our lives, we sometimes lose sight of what gives us joy and allocate our time to the myriad of distractions that deplete our energy to pursue our satisfaction and our authentic purpose. I have lost sight of what gives me joy many times as I performed roles out of obligation or simply seeing out a commitment that I regretted. The only way out of those moments was to pursue the opportunities that energized me and find spaces that aligned my authentic self with a deeper meaning. One vivid example of this directly happened after I graduated with my PhD and was in my first year of teaching. Happy to have a job, and I was still exhausted and something was missing. Luckily, I received a fellowship at the University of Florida to go behind Zora Neale Hurston to identify what was going on in the communities that she had collected folklore in. Hurston's life and work fascinated me as a graduate student, and her investment in Black folk community and places of culture autonomy continued to ignite me. When I arrived in Laufman, the location Hurston had written about in Mules and Men and her co-authored play Polk County, I stepped into a dynamic where the concerned citizens of Laufman were trying to figure out how to stave off development that threatened to encroach their community from Orange County, which is the home of Disney. The prevailing idea among the white residents there was to create restrictive building codes that harkened back to the 1920s Milltown that Hurston had documented and written about on the page. But when Black residents got Mules and Men and Polk County, her co-authored play, in their hands, they began to see themselves in the stories and know a more accurate cultural resource was at their disposal. We centered our first Black History Festival on that rich heritage, and I felt more centered than ever. For the second festival, the residents had bigger dreams and decided to stage the play Polk County. I had never written a grant before, and I got one from the Florida Humanities Council on behalf of the residents to pay for costumes, printing the script, and a stage. During the rehearsal process, though, my life changed forever. A few days before the production, Miss Sint gave me the key to the small cinder block community so I could set up for rehearsal. When I slid that key into the door and turned the lock, I knew right then that that's what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I wanted to facilitate space for meaningful cultural conversations in community. It might involve academic circles and students, but my joy, my satisfaction rested in co-creating relevance for history and culture with the people on the ground. Together, we elevated authentic voices, learned new tools, built the structures that we needed to acquire the sustenance to make it happen. I got more than a taste of what it meant to be authentic. I ate multiple helpings of sustainability and boiled peanuts, too, from the giant cast iron kettle that Miss Griffin, one of the organizers, tended. Authenticity is a hot topic. A prevalent idea about this way of life is that it provides a sense of satisfaction, but that it comes with a cost. And that cost is the result that the individual stands mostly alone in their brave insistence on a unique, or maybe even a weird, self-assertion. What's missing from these conversations is that just authenticity emerges not from a person's solo and sometimes isolated journey, but when a community wraps around and supports the dreamer, the enchanted, the doer. The essential ingredient here is to generate safe emotional and physical space for self-realization. And that space fundamentally shifts our internal and social landscapes and has built illustrative social movements that continue to enrich our lives. And this is what I'm calling creative justice, the critical part of regenerating authenticity. Creative justice isn't something new. I've just given it a name. It's resistance to slavery and colonization, women's empowerment movements, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender activism are just a few of these creative justice movements that have changed the world. Now, what is creative justice? Creative justice relies on three concentrated experiences. The first is when we indulge in joyous inclinations and discovery. It's when we develop the energizing inclinations and experiences when we feel, follow, and develop our places of peaceful enrichment. It's when we are able to figure out and unapologetically live as our interconnected self. It's when we live in the honesty of that self and feed ourselves from the courage to live it. Since full justice is not accessing only our own satisfaction, this element asks that we notice what enlivens the people around us. It's when we see the dreams that they refuse to relinquish. In Loftman, I was energized by my love for Hurston and discovered a new imperative for creating space for community work. Others could recognize in my enthusiasm, and I was emboldened to help as I saw the community create their own interpretations of joy and culture. By connecting to the truth of their history, the concerned citizens were energized to take a culturally relevant stand against gentrification. And this stand required courage to resist prevailing notions. The second concentration is when we are gaining the tools and the opportunities to share our authentic discoveries. This is when we have the tools and the space to become versed in our passions. This is when we have the opportunity to share our authentic expressions to a wider audience. This is the canvas and the exhibit space, the words and the listener, the microphone and the stage. In Loftman, I began honing the skill of listening and articulating to engage in meaningful conversations with others. I began to see how to nurture the connection between historical and cultural knowledge and civic engagement. Together, we engaged Hurston's rich stories on a community level and co-created new relevance for her work and for a larger audience. Now, the final concentration is when we are regenerating the benefits of authentic living. We give and we receive the advantages of authentic expression. Knowing who we are, having the tools, and sharing them is not enough. For this justice to be effective, we must be sustained in our genuineness and receive regenerative energy from those expressions. The most obvious expression is to pay people for their skilled pursuits, to contribute to an economy that puts money in their pocket as they contribute their light. In the best possible scenario, we find ways to take a developed inclination and generate some income. Regenerative authenticity puts resources in the hands of people who know best what they need and how to use those assets that they have. Yet, money is not the only form of support. Sustenance happens when we attend somebody's event, ask about the person's affections, tell others about the exciting things someone is doing. Whatever resources we have, we as a community must invest. I'll say again, self-realization is not the end goal. It is not enough for the authentic to be sustained themselves. Authenticity did not happen in an isolated vacuum, and it is only as powerful as it gives back in some spirit of community support that nurtured it. In a creatively just world, those who have been poured into pass on the skills and opportunity and resources for authentic exploration for someone or something else. And we all reap the benefits of living in a world of joyous, authentic people. My lessons from Loftman and many conscious and unconscious experiences with authenticity and creative justice occurred as a grown person. But looking back, I am clear that it started, as it really should, in childhood. This liberatory philosophy unfolded during my experience as a girl growing up in Chicago, Saginaw, and Kalamazoo, fascinated with driving, music, and social studies. As adults, we don't often know what childish behaviors or interests will turn into excitements, careers, or contributions, but I was nurtured by an outstanding team of neighbors, teachers, customers, and family. Some of these teachers remain my biggest supporters even today. Shout out to Miss Aiken and Miss Johnson, and inspirations in my grown woman work, and have taught me about the best practices of long-term investment in youth. I was held up and inspired by black hubs as I occupied as a child that I later learned people called ghettos. These Midwestern black Wall Streets provided a consistent message for me to insist on economic and cultural autonomy and our collective rights. I also learned that space was contested, that safe space was not a guarantee. The support of caring adults in an empowering community was also tempered by our exposure to racial violence. I knew firsthand what classism looked like for us poor and black people relegated near soot-spewing automobile plants, and the stigma and intimidation of social service systems. Always a tomboy, I and other girls radically shifted gendered notions of leadership, athletics, clothing, and a girl's place in a drumline. Perhaps because my parents understood the impact of all these elements, they doubled down in their belief in me exploring my emerging inclinations. They invested in me so fully that they gave up a precious resource in our small two-bedroom home: space for my soapbox derby car when I was 13. They knew I wanted to drive. The first trouble I ever got into in school was because I would rush through my work to get to the steering wheel built into the wooden box and drive. When I was left alone in the car, my parents would go in to get a bag of tacos from Taco Villa or fulfill any other task, and I always slipped into the driver's seat. Whether it was a wooden box or a green 1968 Dodge Dart, I was headed west to California, Disneyland to be exact. Short of the driving lessons on country roads and in the cemeteries where my parents insisted I couldn't hurt anybody, I had to wait until I was 15 to start driving. But the soapbox derby, that gave me the chance to get behind the wheel of my own car. My mother enlisted Mr. David, our neighbor and my regular raking and snow shoveling customer, to help me build the car. I was elated to learn how to use saws and sanders and drills. I hit up our neighborhood pharmacy for a sponsorship, and I couldn't wait to compete with boys and race down one of the very few hills we have in Saginaw. I was hopeful I would win. On race day, I beat one boy, and my brakes blew out on the second, and they had to catch me in a blanket. The race was over for me, but the car remained in our living room for another year before we moved to a bigger house with a basement. My mother, a teacher. My first father, a musician and bartender, driver of taxi cabs and hearses. My second father, a construction worker, a bus driver, and a school paraprofessional, never told me what I should be when I grew up. But they made the space for me to explore my authenticity despite the largesse of the space that I took up. There are so many ways that these experiences in Loftman and Saginaw translated to my professional and lived experience as a public scholar. But moving to Kalamazoo 20 years ago brought all of these lessons together for me. As we were looking for space to develop a creative center, we walked into the fire station on Portage Road. The moment I walked in the space, the endless opportunities hung tangibly in the air, and I could see a space where people could imagine themselves in their visions. For the next 10 years, I put the key in that door to open it for countless people and cultural events. Many times, I felt a cord linking me back to that key in Loffman. At FIRE, I was able to recognize and cultivate the process we came to call creative justice. I began to understand the importance of the passionate economy in getting people paid and sustained for the creative work that they did to enrich themselves and improve our world. I was constantly reminded of the need for space and sustaining community support, and quite honestly, often depleted by the fight to receive the support in the nonprofit world. And most importantly, I invested in people and ideas that have yielded long-term examples of the efficacy of this approach, and some of them right over there. I left FIRE 9 years ago, but even during my time there, I dreamed of creating the Institute of Public Scholarship to further realize the connection between community and critical questions in the arts, humanities, and sciences. The Institute is a multi-generational movement in youth development, environmentalism, artistic access and production, genealogy, wellness, and housing for those most impacted by housing insecurity and homelessness. Since June, we secured a space with another door to open to a broad community. But this time, we made copies of the key. And those copies go to an incredible team finding and fulfilling their satisfaction, their authentic inclination for opening the door to a space where they can cultivate their authentic selves and create systems that will put new keys in the hands of others. While we may not always be opening literal doors, we can all learn from those before us to nurture our energizing inclinations and invest in our support for others' internal sense of satisfaction. And in so doing, we will undoubtedly live in a more fulfilling world. Thank you.